Radical Romance, relationship series. Who's excited about romance, radical romance? Across the congregations, so from London to Huntingdon, ourselves here in Slough, we're part of this one church in the UK called Every Nation, and we've got a family of churches throughout the country. And we're doing this series together called Radical Romance, looking at our relationships and our romantic relationships at that. So, it's a 6-week series. As I say, we're going to be exploring some really interesting topics. There's opportunity for you to actually ask your questions, and we'll be able to try and answer those in the weeks to come. But I guess you could say why. Why are we doing this series on relationships? Well, the bottom line really is that we are created for relationship. If we look at Scripture, God created us in His image. He's a triune God. He's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. So He Himself is in relationship with Himself. And He designed us and created us for relationship, and for attraction, and for passion, and for sex, and for marriage. This is how we've been designed and created, and we're going to be exploring this over the next 6 weeks. I mean, if you just examine yourself, if you just think about your own thought life, your desires, your passions, your dreams, your hopes and ambitions, I'm pretty sure we can all agree that generally speaking, you're not alone in that thought or in that hope or in that ambition, but there's someone else with you. It's about being in a relationship with someone, and that, generally speaking, sort of enhances this point that we're created for this relationship and romantic relationships. So if you examine your thinking and how you plan, you typically have someone alongside you that you're doing that with. Whether you're married or single, there is this element of being together and being in a relationship with someone. And so I'd like you to turn to each other in a moment and just ask yourselves a question: what has most influenced or impacted or defined or helped you gain understanding on romantic relationships? What is it that has most influenced you, your thoughts, your views, your understanding of relationships? Just turn to the person next to you, ask them that question, hear what they're saying, and then we'll continue. Okay, so any shout-outs of what has most influenced or defined or shaped your thinking on relationships? Anyone want to shout out? It doesn't have to be your own. It can be what your friend said. Come on, we're going to get into groups later to discuss things, but just right now, just shout out what's been the most influential thing, or some of the influences. Come on, Paul. Trust and faithfulness has influenced your perception on romantic relationships. Okay, cool. Family, yeah? Any others? Sorry? Bible, yes, good one. Very good. We're in a church. Any others? Movies, yes, movies. Compassion, yeah. Friends, yeah. Media. Parents, perhaps. Maybe a bit of Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. Okay, so we can understand that there are lots of things, lots of elements, lots of influences that can help or determine or influence in some way, whether that's a good influence or a bad influence. We can acknowledge that there are things in our lives that shape and influence and shape in some ways how we approach relationships. And I'm going to start with my story this morning, just to make you feel comfortable that, we're all broken and all messed up, and church is a good place to be, to feel welcome. And that we all need help, guys. That really is the point here that we do all need help. And I needed help. I needed help drastically. I mean, I still need help daily. Who can put up their hand and admit that they actually need help too? But I really needed help. I was young and my early 20s and got married. And with the right intention, the right belief, the right dreams and ambitions about what this marriage would be. But it didn't work out. And I ended up 3 years later getting divorced. And that brought loads of questions and loads of tension and loads of uncertainty in my life, in my heart, in my relating to the God of the Bible, this Jesus that I'd known all my life. And so really questioned, how does this work? I needed help. Questions about grace. Is there grace, for divorce? Is there grace? Lots of questions, lots of uncertainty. And I needed help and truth. And there's a point there. I needed help and truth. And so do you. And I really acknowledged that I needed that. And there was one place, well, two places that I turned for that help. The one was the Bible, and the other was the church that I was in South Africa. And I encountered God in a radical way. I encountered Jesus in a radically new way. As I said, I grew up knowing God, knowing the church, knowing Jesus all my life. But something about that season in my life made certain things a whole lot more real. When you have to wrestle with certain things in a new way, they almost become more your own, and you understand some of these truths a bit more. You sometimes understand God and his nature and Jesus more. And the value, just a little side note here, of actually being part of a church community and being plugged in with a connect group, with church leaders, with friends in the church, wrestling through these big questions. And sometimes, I don't know if you guys can relate to this, but sometimes you're asking questions and you don't necessarily want the answer. You just want to be heard. You just want to express where you're at. You want to just wrestle honestly with the disappointments and the misunderstandings and the hurt. And so church is a great place to do that. So this Jesus that I encountered, he's the one who I sort of, as I said, discovered in a new way. This Jesus who loves radically, who pursues you extravagantly. We talk in the follow course about God's prodigal love, his extravagant love, his ridiculous love that makes no sense. And something about a situation like I went through with that divorce was discovering this heart of God who is full of grace. This Jesus who is mercy, he is peace, he is love. And there was no judgment from him. There was no condemnation, but there were arms open wide. And so my story is not unique. I mean, we all know that divorce is a common occurrence, and there's a lot of hurt and a lot of brokenness. I mean, Elike led us in a prayer about this nation, about society as a whole, and the brokenness that we find ourselves in. And just to encourage us here that our stories, it's not helpful when we compare our stories. That my story is not unique and your story is not unique, but you are unique. And how God relates to you is unique. And so wherever you're coming at this morning, however you found yourself sitting here this morning, God has intently put you here for a reason. And he knows your situation. He knows your story. He knows where you're at. And so whether you call yourself a Christian or a follower of Jesus, a believer of him, in him or not, you're welcome. And I hope that you feel welcome today. And I just trust that this morning as we start to unpack something of these relationships that we're created for, that you'll feel that welcome, you'll feel that at home, that this is a place where we can bring our questions. This is a place where we can bring our wrestling, where we can come with our uncertainty and our doubts. 2 weeks ago, as I mentioned, we spoke about finances and how God speaks into our finances. And God, fortunately, he speaks into all of our lives, including our relationships, and even dating and sex. And we're going to be talking about sex in a few weeks' time, along with many other topics. Because I'm sure we can all agree that relationships are not easy. The person that you're sitting next to right now, whatever degree of that relationship is, it's not easy. There's give and there's take, and there's sacrifice, and there's things that are hard to get through. And then you add the romantic side to relationships, and that takes it to a whole other level. Would you agree with that? That romantic relationships are not easy. They require work. And so we can have these hopes that perhaps it'll all work out, that relationships, romantic relationships, we'll just bump into that person that's right for us, and we'll all live happily ever after. But the reality is that navigating this path, this road of finding the right person, falling in love, making all that work, it's not as easy as the movies make it out to be. Yeah? And besides these internal struggles that we have, we're influenced by the world around us, this broken, messed up world with all its influences, with all its voices shouting at us. From TikTok to YouTube to Instagram to the movies that we watch. I mean, it's not hard to see how broken society is when we look at the TV, when we look at movies, when we look at TV shows that are out there, when we see the things that are happening on social media. There's a lot of voices that are vying for our attention, that want to be heard. And we've got a choice to make. Do we hear that? Do we listen to that? Do we go there? Or do we go somewhere else for that advice? Do we go somewhere else for that information that we need along this journey? So regardless of your views and opinions on faith and life, we can all agree that the world we're living in is slightly broken. But God, and that's the good news of the church, is that we have this message of Jesus, that he is the solution, he is the answer, he is our help and our truth. And that really is the one point this morning, is that Jesus is your help, and Jesus is the truth that we can turn to. So wherever we're at this morning, Jesus speaks to us. Jesus wants to speak into our hearts, into our lives, into our situation. As I said, some of us here might be sitting and we're married, we're happily married. He speaks into your situation. Some of us perhaps unhappily married. Jesus speaks into that situation. Some of us are single by choice, and Jesus speaks into that situation. Some of us are sitting here and are single not by choice. We'd much rather be with someone. We're feeling lonely, slightly depressed, slightly jaded perhaps, that things haven't worked out how they'd hoped, how you'd hoped. But Jesus speaks into that situation. Some of us are divorced, separated, painfully dumped perhaps. Jesus speaks into those situations. Some of us perhaps are exploring what dating could be like, what it is. Maybe we're getting to that stage of our lives where we're now looking at other people, the opposite sex, or even the same sex, and having these questions about your gender, about your attraction, about what is right, what is wrong. Who do we turn to for this information? Who do we turn to for this advice, for this guidance? Some of us might be parents asking the question, how do I have these conversations with my kids? How do I help them in understanding what is right? How do I earn their respect to speak into their lives? Jesus speaks to you, and he wants to impart truth to you, to wherever you're at. You know, maybe some of us are actually sitting here going, I am sorted. My relationship is amazing. My relationship is fantastic. I don't need this. And I want to encourage you that yes, you do. Because the kingdom of God is one of stewardship. We steward what we have. And when we steward that well, he's a God who rewards us with more. And so maybe you're sitting here with your A-OK, everything's perfect relationship, to actually be a blessing to someone else, to actually be a light to someone else's darkness. Maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a brother or a sister, or your neighbor who needs what you have. And maybe God's actually positioned you in their lives to be a blessing to them. So I want to encourage you, wherever you find yourself in this relationship journey, on this relationship road, that Jesus has truth that he wants to impart to you. Jesus has truth that he wants to speak to you. So can we come honest? Can we be willing to come along this journey of the next 6 weeks and just be honest with ourselves, be honest with the church, be honest with God, perhaps even surrender some of our presuppositions, some of our thoughts that we think we know what God says, we think we know what the church says. Maybe surrender some of these misconceptions and just come willing to let God speak. Come on an honest journey together. And it's that thing of together. It's this relationship where we're designed to do life together. We're not designed, we've spoken about this many times, that we're not designed to be an island isolated, but we're designed to be doing life together. So whether that's a romantic relationship together, or whether that's even just a friendship, togetherness, we're designed to do this together. So I've got a question on the slide here, which is, what relationship question would you like to ask Jesus? Well, they've worded it, the next one, Caesar, the QR code. So what relationship question would you like the church to answer? And so you've got some paper that you hopefully might be sitting on. It's a pen. There's also some communion elements which we'll have later, so I hope you haven't sat on that. But there's some paper there. There's a QR code up here, and there's a few dotted around the building. You'll see these A4 pink pages, and it's got a QR code in the middle. You can just scan that, and it'll take you to our online survey where you can anonymously ask any question that you like. And between the congregations, we're then going to gather all of these questions and answer them, do our best to answer them. But you can also go old school and just take that piece of paper that I've given you and just write down any questions that you've got. I'll also be sending a link out via email tomorrow, which again takes you to this online survey, and you can post your questions there, and they'll be ranked in order of popularity, and then we'll do our best to answer these. Because it's good to come honest, it's good to come with these questions, and so allow God to speak. So we're going to turn now to Matthew chapter 19. And it's a great story of some religious people in Jesus' day, some Pharisees. So these guys were actually teachers. They would sit in the synagogues and the place where people would come and worship together. And they would sit there and they would debate the scriptures. They would talk about them. And Jesus came along, the Son of God. And he was quite radical in his approach to life and his approach to relating to God and what that looked like. And so these religious leaders, these guys who knew the law backwards, they even added more laws to the laws that were already there. So they came with a question to Jesus, just like we're coming right now with our questions. And they asked this question in Matthew chapter 19 from verse 3 to 6. Some Pharisees came to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And that's the basis of the scripture that we're using this morning, Matthew 19. And we're going to just break it down. Jesus starts by answering. He doesn't give them the answer to their question, but he answers their question by asking another question. And he's saying, "Have you not read? Have you not read?" He refers back to the book of Genesis, the first book, the book of beginnings, as it were. And he refers back and says, "Have you not read?" This is before the law was even imposed. This is before the law came. So Jesus refers back to this beginning, this original intent that God had for human relationships, for man and a woman. If Jesus refers back to an ultimate truth, an actual guide, how much more do we need that? And I would ask us the question, where do we turn? for our influence on relationships? Where do we turn for that advice? Someone mentioned the Bible. Someone mentioned family. Someone mentioned friends. We've spoken about our uber-sexualized culture that we live in. This culture, just cancel when you like it. Do what feels right. Where do we turn? Jesus turned to the beginning. Jesus turned to Scripture. Jesus turned to the original blueprint. And our job as a church is to actually hold up this original blueprint, to hold up this standard as the actual source of truth, of morality. That truth is not just relative. There's ultimate truth. And it's found in the Word. It's found in the book. And we can refer to it. So where do you turn? Then he goes on, so have you not read? It says that he who created them from the beginning. We are created. We had an incredible series a few months ago about our identity and how we're created in the image of God. But Jesus, again, here refers to the fact that we were created. He who created them from the beginning. We spoke a little while ago about a manual and how when you get something, you typically refer to the manual so that you can get the best use out of that product. I gave an illustration of a TV game console and how as soon as I opened the manual, things just started making sense. Without the manual, I was fluffing around and fumbling and going through different menus and just really struggling to get the answers to make this TV game console work. But then open the manual and voila, everything just makes sense. I'm sure you can relate with your phones, your TVs, your whatever electronic gadgets you might have. Or even just putting together some IKEA furniture. We need a manual. Trying to do it by yourself doesn't always work. But using the manual, it brings some clarity, it brings some perspective. Likewise with the Word. When we use that and see that as our actual guide, our actual foundation for truth, that when we actually start trying to do it His way, things make sense. And as I said, our God is a relational God who designed us and created us in His image. And so I think He knows best how to lead us and guide us in our relationships, including our romantic relationships. He's all about the romantic relationships. There's a book, Song of Songs, dedicated to relationships, this beautiful picture of two people pursuing one another in romance. Yeah? So God is this God who wants to speak. And this word is sort of like that manual, that foundational book that speaks truth into our lives. And I would just say, if we haven't tried it, why not try it? If you're sitting here today, not quite sure about faith, not quite sure about God, not quite sure about what you're seeing here, or what perhaps friends have said, I'd say give it a go. Try it out. Because I'm pretty sure you put some of these principles into practice and you'd start seeing some fruit in your life, in your relationships, in your living and in your loving. That when we follow His word, when we follow His instructions, some clarity comes. Then he says He made them male and female. I love this. He made them male and female. See, there was no uncertainty. There was no confusion. There was no question in God's mind when He created us, when He created you and me. He created intentionally, on purpose, not by accident, and He created you specifically male and female. There was no confusion in His mind. And I'd argue that a departure from truth in our culture and in society has led this absence of ultimate truth, this absence, this turning away from God and His truth has led to the confusion that we now find ourselves living in. With all that's going on in popular society, in popular culture, regarding gender, regarding sexuality, when we go back to the beginning, God was pretty clear on it. There was no uncertainty in His mind. There was no confusion about whether or not He was making a male or a female. He knew what He was doing. And guys, as a body of believers, we hold up this truth. But Jesus was full of grace, and He welcomed all. So it's not our job to point the finger and to say you're not welcome, but it's our job to embrace with love as Jesus embraced me during a dark time in my life, and as I'm sure Jesus has embraced many of us sitting here today in a dark time. He brings grace. He brings mercy. We look at that story of the woman at the well when she's encountering Jesus. And this lady, she had had 5 husbands. She was living with another guy. I mean, her life in many states was what they would have held up as a poster for, this is a bit of a mess. This is not how you're meant to do it. But she encounters Jesus and she meets love. She meets mercy. She meets grace. She doesn't meet judgment. She doesn't meet a set of rules that he held up and go, well, you didn't do this and this. No, she encountered mercy and truth, grace and love. And that is what we should be doing. So he made them male and female. And then there's a little two words, and said, and that can be skipped over, but I love that because he's quoting how God said. And God has the right to speak, guys. He made us. He created us. He formed us. He has the right to speak into our lives. Yeah? He has the right to speak. Let's let him speak. Let's invite him to speak. And one of the chief ways he speaks is through his word, through time with him, through giving him moments throughout your day to speak into your heart, because he wants to speak. He's a God who's involved. He's not distant. He's not far off. He's not removed. He doesn't just set you going and then just let you go. No, he wants to be involved and he wants to speak. So then Jesus says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother. And the therefore is an important word because it indicates that before what he said there is important. So he says before that he says, I made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother. So it's because of that difference in gender. So it's because we're made male and because we're made female. They come together. They leave and they come together. So because of that difference, we're to be joined together. There's something about the opposite sex that complements us, that we're created for. It fits, it works. By God's original intent, by God's original design. It's no accident. I need what Sam brings. I need who she is. A male and a female need one another. It's because of the difference that we come together. And there's something so interesting about that word as well, where it says, a man shall leave his father and mother. And you could insert there, a woman will leave her father and mother. Because there's a difference between being born a male and being a man. There's a difference between being born female and being a woman. There's something of a maturity, there's something of a growth that takes place, that develops. And you see this relationship that was created, as part of his design, is for a certain stage in our lives. We can't get away from that. A man will leave his mother and father. A woman will leave her mother and father. There's something of a maturity, something of a development. So being born male and being a man is very different. And then he says, and hold fast to his wife. And hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. As I said, we're going to be talking about sex in a few weeks' time. We're going to go right into it, talk all about sex. But this verse here, it speaks about two becoming one. Yes, that is a sexual act. Yes, that is a sexual oneness. But it's also a sort of physical oneness in the sense of two whole people coming together and becoming one. It's unity. It's not two separate, selfish individuals cohabiting. No, that's not the intent. That's not the design. It's two whole people coming. Joe's going to talk about that next week, who we are and how we should come, how we can prepare for a relationship. So it's two whole people coming together and being one. No longer separate. No longer divided. Putting aside those things. Working them through, of course. But coming together, being intentional about working together and becoming one. And that word, hold fast, there's two words, hold fast. We've got to fight for it. This unity, this bond, this covenant, it is going to be challenged. We see that it's challenged daily, and it has been for centuries. We've got to fight for it. We've got to hold fast to it. Hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one. What therefore God has joined together, he goes on. What therefore God has joined together. That speaks of this covenant before God. God has joined us together. It's this relationship not just between two people doing their thing, signing a document and going on their way. No, in the eyes of God, it's a covenant before him. It's a legal binding document that he witnesses and that he endorses, puts his blessing upon it the moment it happens. There's a spiritual element to that. And I think in a world that has negated God and that has put God and ultimate truth to the side, that whole spiritual element is a mystery and is ignored. But it's this beautiful picture, actually, that when we're in a marriage, that we have the opportunity to explore this mystery, what this looks like. It's not just two physical people coming together, but there's actually a spiritual oneness that occurs. There's a spiritual unity, a joining that happens. And I would just say that what I've found so life-giving in marriage is, as I said, some of us can relate. There can be difficulties. There can be this feeling of you're on opposite sides and you're just not understanding one another. Or things can go through seasons where it's tough and other seasons when it's good. But in order to actually grow in the spiritual oneness, if we're each committed to growing in God and to growing in our relationship with God, and if we each make that commitment and each journey on that together, so if you also imagine God is here and I'm here and Sam's here, if we're each committed to going closer to God, we actually get closer to each other the closer we draw to God. So there's something of that I want to encourage us, this oneness that God has ordained and created in marriage. So if you're struggling in your marriage and your relationship, I would just say commit to each other to actually put God first, to move toward God together. And only you can be responsible for yourself, and your spouse can be responsible for themselves. But I would encourage you that there's such a oneness that comes spiritually. It's not just a physical oneness. And then he says, let man not separate. Let man not separate. And you see, this happens slowly over time. We don't typically decide to willfully depart from truth or to willfully allow brokenness to set in. It happens over time. It's slow. It's the little things that we just allow to just creep in. Unforgiveness, bitterness, those things set in over time. It says, let not man separate. Don't slowly allow these things to happen. Because we know that culture and society is out to destroy every marriage, every relationship. But there's another way. It's through Jesus that we're able to actually, when we seek Jesus, when we're actually committed to seeking him first, that he enables us in our relationships, in our search for a relationship, in our hunger or desire for a relationship. As we pursue Jesus, he enables us, he leads us, he guides us. And we need to fight for this view, guys. We need to fight for this view in this world where Instagram's got a loud voice, and YouTube and every other social media channel and every movie and every TV show. They're all trying to inform our view. We've got to fight for this view. Hold fast, Jesus says. So I would encourage us, as I look to start landing here, that Jesus is the one that we seek for this truth. That Jesus is the one who is the truth, who is the one to help us. And if we can just start by acknowledging that we actually need some of that help, that we actually can't do this relationship thing alone, that we actually do need absolute truth, an ultimate guide to speak into our lives. And that truth, that person is Jesus, the person of Jesus, as I've said. He changes everything. And this whole series is called Radical Romance. And I love that word radical. It just speaks about doing things in a different way. When we look at Jesus, he lived a different life. He didn't just try and fit in and just try and blend in and just sort of, get away without being unnoticed. No, he stood for truth. He stood for ultimate truth. And he lived a radically different life. And he invites us, all of us, whether you're a follower of him or not, he invites us into this journey with him. He invites us to live a life that is so radically different. He often spoke about his Father's kingdom and being about the Father's business and how that was coming to earth. And we're living for his kingdom here on earth. That's not going to happen by just going in a sort of similar vein to the world. The world's sort of doing this and we're just going to sort of go with them slightly. No, he calls us to be radically different, to be countercultural, to be so different that it's obvious. I mean, Elike in his prayer alluded to the fact that there's something about us, called ones by God, ones that are following Jesus, to be so different. And again, this challenge to us, if you don't know him, if you don't believe this, to try some of these principles, to try some of this recipe that he's got. It'll radically change our lives. Joining a community before you believe, that's totally fine. You don't have to sign any agreement to come and be part of this discovery with us. We belong together. And as we belong, as we grow, some of these questions get answered. We do life together and it gets messy. But Jesus leads us in that. So in terms of a response, I would just say acknowledge that you need help. Acknowledge that you need help. There's no shame in it. If we're honest with yourselves, we actually need help all the time. This isn't a one and done thing. And then perhaps choose Jesus. I would encourage us to choose Jesus for that help, to choose him for that truth. I'd just like us to get into groups now. Is that okay? Get into some groups. We're just going to have a discussion for 5 minutes. There's going to be some questions on the slide. So don't be shy. Yep, groups actually happens by turning around and moving your chair and talking to some people. And maybe just think about, how do I need help? You don't have to get too honest if you don't want to, that's okay. But it does start with the question, how do I need help? I know we've got the youth in the back there, that's great guys. You turn to one another. So if you need help with the question, how do I need help? Where do I go to for that help? And what one thing from today could I do? Could I apply? Okay, is that clear? And then Sarah's going to come up in a moment and she's